For centuries, one of the greatest political thinkers in history has been turned into a cartoon villain. Machiavelli became a synonym for betrayal, coldness, and manipulation. But that's not just an oversimplification. It's a fraud. The real Machiavelli didn't teach people to lie or to crush others out of pure malice. He exposed the brutal game of power with a kind of blunt honesty that still makes people uncomfortable today. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how they lied about Machiavelli, why they did it, and what his philosophy really has to say to anyone who wants to understand the world without illusions. When we hear the name Machiavelli, a lot of people instantly think of betrayal, manipulation, and cold-blooded strategy. But does that image really do justice to the real man behind the legend? To understand who Machiavelli actually was, we need to go back in time and stand on the unstable ground of Renaissance Florence, a place constantly torn between power, art, and war. Picture a city shining like an intellectual lighthouse for all of Europe, where artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci walked the same streets where political conspiracies were being plotted. That was Florence in the 15th and 16th centuries, the cradle of the Renaissance, but also a minefield of fights between powerful families, like the Medici and Republican factions dreaming of a city free from tyranny. In this intense and dangerous setting, Niccolò de Machiavelli was born in 1469. He came from a poor noble family and grew up surrounded by books and instability. From a young age, he had access to classical authors like Livy and Cicero, who shaped his sharp view of power, fate, and human virtues. But don't imagine him locked away in libraries his whole life. Machiavelli was a man of action, and it was in the political arena that he really stood out. In 1498, at 29 years old, Machiavelli was appointed secretary of the Second Chancery of the Florentine Republic, a key position. He wasn't just some low-level clerk. His job involved high-level diplomacy, political intelligence, and, above all, a deep understanding of how power games actually work. This was Florence after the fall of the Medici, when the Republic had been restored following the downfall of the Dominican friar Savonarola, who had ruled the city for a while with a strict, religious, almost theocratic iron hand. As secretary, Machiavelli went on diplomatic missions to France, Germany, and other Italian states, meeting kings, popes, and generals face to face. He dealt with people like Cesare Borgia, the feared Renaissance prince who later inspired the idealized figure in The Prince. On these trips, Machiavelli didn't just represent Florence. He quietly watched the machinery of power up close, with no romantic illusions. He saw corrupt popes, double-dealing allies, and how fragile diplomatic promises really were. All of that would later be distilled into his political philosophy, a way of thinking that doesn't reject morality, but understands that the morality of politics is something different, a morality of results, responsibility, and realism. But like so many others in history, Machiavelli was taken down not by personal enemies, but by the tides of politics. In 1512, the Medici came back to power with the help of Pope Julius II and Spanish troops. The Republic was dissolved. Machiavelli was kicked out of office, accused of conspiracy, arrested, tortured, and eventually released. But the message was clear. His political career was over. At 43, exiled on his small country property, with no public role, no salary, and no influence, he could easily have disappeared from history. But that's exactly when the real genius of Machiavelli appeared. Thrown out of power, he became a writer of power. And from that moment came the works that made him immortal. During his exile, Machiavelli wrote intensely, as if every line were a way to try to get back into the political game. The most famous of these works is The Prince, written in 1513 and dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, the new ruler of Florence. Many people see that dedication as pure flattery, but it can also be read as a desperate attempt to win his way back, or, in other interpretations, as a subtle criticism of tyranny itself. But Machiavelli didn't stop there. He also wrote the discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, where he shows his preference for republics and lasting institutions. This book is very different from The Prince. There, Machiavelli defends popular participation, the importance of good laws, and the constant need to guard against corruption. He also wrote The Art of War, where he discusses military organization as a central part of political stability, and plays like the Mandrake, which expose, with sharp irony, the social and political vices of his time. You can already see how complex this thinker is. He's not just the author of a manual on how to grab and keep power. Machiavelli is a sharp observer of institutions, a critic of human vices, and, above all, a patriot who dreamed of a unified Italy and of freedom for his city. It's crucial to understand that Machiavelli wasn't writing from a throne or protected by privilege. His ideas were born out of defeat, frustration, and a deep love for his homeland. In a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, he said that when he wrote The Prince, he entered the palaces of the ancients and talked with them as if he were their equal. That image is powerful, a man isolated from power, yet speaking with the greatest minds in history to try to understand his own present. His writing is marked by a tough realism that shocked many people in his time and still shocks people today. But his goal was never to promote immorality. He wanted to understand how power really works, not how we wish it would work. That's a hard lesson to accept. As Machiavelli wrote, "There's such a big gap between how people really live and how they ought to live, that anyone who gives up what actually happens for what should happen ends up ruining himself instead of saving himself." The Italy of Machiavelli's time was divided, invaded by foreign powers, manipulated by papal interests, and constantly at risk of collapse from within. The republic he served had fallen, and the world he knew was changing. Even so, he dared to think about politics in a new way, as a practical science based on experience and the observation of facts, not on the utopias of philosophers. That's why Machiavelli is often seen as a pioneer of modern political science. He was one of the first to clearly separate religious morality from political action, and to argue that the stability of the state depends more on the virtue of the ruler than on his piety. It was a bold idea, but a necessary one in a time when Christian morality was often used as a mask to justify terrible abuses of power. Machiavelli was not an evil mastermind. He wasn't a preacher of lies or of pointless manipulation. He was a man deeply committed to his city, his time, and the search for a new way of thinking about power. What he saw and lived taught him that idealism without pragmatism leads to failure, and that politics demands more than good intentions. It demands practical wisdom, courage, and sometimes very hard choices. Very few names in history have been as badly misunderstood as Machiavelli's. Today, when someone is called Machiavellian, the image that usually comes to mind is a cold, manipulative person who will do anything for power, even if it costs other people their dignity. In movies, books, and even news headlines, Machiavellian has become a synonym for evil hiding behind strategy. But what if I told you that's a huge distortion? That the real Machiavelli was actually a thinker trying to understand power, not justify abuse of it. To see how this lie spread, we need to go back to the roots, not just of Machiavelli's philosophy, but of the very language used to talk about him. The word Machiavellian gained strength in the public imagination centuries after his death, completely detached from the real context of his work. The adjective took on a negative meaning that Machiavelli never clearly defended. The problem is that, eager to condemn political cynicism, many critics used his name as a symbol of evil, while ignoring what he actually wrote, and that has serious consequences. When we say something is Machiavellian in the sense of cruel or inhuman, we're not just oversimplifying, we're also fooling ourselves about what politics really is. Contrary to what people think, Machiavelli didn't write to promote selfishness or authoritarianism, but to describe how power works in real life, especially in times of crisis. He wrote The Prince during a period of deep instability in Italy, when the Italian states were divided, vulnerable to foreign invasions, and dominated by family interests and the church. In that context, Machiavelli argued that an effective ruler would have to act with pragmatism, even if that meant making morally difficult decisions. Of course, that makes people uncomfortable, especially those who believe politics must always be morally pure or driven only by good intentions. But Machiavelli saw politics as a field of constant conflict, where naivete is a fast track to failure, or worse, to being dominated by those who are not naive at all. The man who always wants to be good will come to ruin among so many who are not good. This line, often ripped out of context, is not praise for evil. It's a warning about how fragile it is to stay pure in a world where others aren't. And more than that, it's an invitation to be clear-eyed. Machiavelli believed a ruler should be ready for the worst-case scenarios, not because he liked cruelty, but because he preferred hard truth over comfortable illusion. The distortion of his image really started to take shape in the 16th century, when the Catholic Church put the prince on the index of prohibited books, Index Librorum Prohibitorum. Why? Because Machiavelli dared to separate politics from religion and refused to take Christian morality as the foundation for government. For that time, this was unforgivable. On top of that, the structure of the prince itself is ambiguous. He writes in a cold tone, analyzes examples of political cruelty, and praises the effectiveness of controversial figures like Cesare Borgia. At first glance, it really can look like a handbook for manipulation. But when you read carefully, you see that Machiavelli isn't recommending senseless cruelty. He's examining when it was used successfully, when it failed, and what the consequences were. A good example is the episode where Cesare Borgia, after conquering the Romagna region, uses a brutal subordinate to crush resistance with violence. Once order is restored, Borgia has that same subordinate killed in public, as a way to show people he doesn't approve of cruelty. Machiavelli tells this story with a kind of fascination for political cleverness, but not with moral approval. He doesn't say it's good, he says it worked. That difference is crucial. Describing what works is not the same as saying it's morally right. It's like a doctor describing how a disease progresses. He's not cheering for the fever, he's trying to understand it. Over the centuries, Machiavelli's figure drifted further and further away from his writings. He became a character in plays, political pamphlets, novels, and movies, almost always portrayed as a symbol of treachery and cold calculation. Shakespeare, for example, used the Machiavel as a stock image of the scheming villain in his tragedies. The name became a stigma, and that's how the pop culture Machiavelli was born. A man with no principles, sneaky, always ready to stab someone in the back. This cartoon version of Machiavelli is easy to understand, easy to hate, and for that very reason endlessly repeated. But he has almost nothing to do with the Machiavelli of the books, the careful reader of Roman history, the defender of republics, the critic of mercenary armies, the thinker who wanted a unified Italy, free from foreign powers. In his discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, Machiavelli writes, "Freedom is born from the constant struggle between the great and the people." Here we see the Republican thinker, worried about balance between social forces, very far from the image of a shapeless manipulator. Part of the problem comes from the fact that many readers want to apply the same moral standards of private life to the political sphere. Machiavelli knew that doesn't work. He argued that a ruler's ethics should be based on responsibility for outcomes, not only on intentions. If a ruler fails to protect his people because he refuses to make hard choices, he's not virtuous, he's negligent. In that sense, Machiavelli anticipates what Max Weber would later call the ethic of responsibility, the idea that you're morally accountable for the real consequences of your political actions. This kind of thinking is extremely relevant today. We still see leaders hiding behind moral speeches while making terrible decisions. Machiavelli forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question. What is more ethical, keeping up a good guy image or acting effectively for the common good, even when that requires toughness? The real scandal of Machiavelli was not that he defended evil. It's that he exposed what the powerful have always known. Power is rarely clean, and those who insist on pretending otherwise end up being crushed by it. He invites us to look at politics without filters, without idealization, and that takes real courage. There's a huge gap between what Machiavelli actually wrote, with his deep, historical, and pragmatic analysis, and what people later started calling Machiavellianism. The confusion between the thinker and the caricature built around his ideas isn't just an intellectual mistake. It's a historical injustice that hides the real richness of Machiavellian thought. In this lesson, we're going to break down this misunderstanding and show how Machiavelli, the philosopher of political realism, was turned into the symbol of a doctrine he never created. Over time, Machiavelli's name became a generic label for any kind of political behavior that's clever, deceptive, or ruthless. That image was shaped not by his complete works, but by a selective, and often bad faith, reading of his most famous book, The Prince. Contrary to what many people think, Machiavelli didn't create a philosophy of deception or unscrupulous domination. He did something much more unsettling. He refused to pretend that power is always fair, that rulers are always virtuous, or that politics follows pure morality. He started from reality, not utopia. As he himself wrote, "Many have imagined republics and principalities that never existed, but whoever gives up what is done for what should be done learns first how to bring about his own ruin." In other words, Machiavelli is saying loud and clear, politics doesn't work based on what it should be, but on what it is. That is the core of his philosophy. He's not justifying evil. He's explaining the context in which tough and sometimes harsh decisions are made. Machiavellian or Machiavellianist. This is where the confusion begins. The word Machiavellian eventually became an adjective with a life of its own, completely disconnected from the author. It came to describe any manipulative, selfish, or amoral behavior, as if Machiavelli had taught that lying, betraying, or dominating others was always the smartest path. The problem is that this interpretation totally ignores the limits, warnings, and specific historical contexts he actually gives. Even worse, this misunderstanding led to what we now call Machiavellianism, a doctrine that isn't Machiavelli's at all, but was built in his name by cherry-picking dramatic lines from The Prince. This doctrine suggests that power should be pursued at any cost, that the ends always justify the means, and that politics is essentially a dirty game. But Machiavelli never said that in those words, and never said it in that way. What people call Machiavellianism is really a biased and incomplete reading. It ignores all of Machiavelli's work on republics, institutions, civic virtue, and the role of the citizen, core themes of the discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, a work that reveals a thinker deeply concerned with political stability and collective freedom. A common mistake is assuming that because Machiavelli didn't follow the moral standards of traditional Christian ethics, he must have been defending evil. But that's a false dilemma. Machiavelli rejects moralistic idealism because it doesn't work in real politics. That doesn't mean he supports politics without ethics. On the contrary, he proposes an ethics specific to politics, an ethics of responsibility, prudence, and effectiveness aimed at the common good. What sets him apart from thinkers like Plato, Aquinas, or Augustine is that he doesn't begin with an ideal model of society. He starts with what he actually sees in the world, and what he sees is instability, ambition, betrayal, fragile alliances, and the constant need for adaptation. For Machiavelli, a ruler's virtue isn't about being pure, it's about being effective and prudent. His famous metaphor of the fox, cunning, and the lion's strength isn't an endorsement of cynicism, but an acknowledgement of the flexibility required to survive turbulent times. Why was Machiavelli's name used to build this twisted doctrine? Partly because his writings were explosive for the moral sensitivity of his time. By setting religion aside and analysing power with cold realism, Machiavelli scared both moralists and the powerful. His work was attacked, censored, and labelled dangerous. So turning him into a public enemy of goodness was easier than actually reading him carefully. Also, Machiavellianism became a convenient ideological tool. By painting him as the founder of political immorality, later thinkers could position their own ideas as good and virtuous in contrast to the supposed evil Machiavelli. It helped justify certain regimes as righteous while demonizing others. Why does this distinction matter? Separating Machiavelli from Machiavellianism isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential for anyone who wants to understand politics without illusions, but also without falling into empty cynicism. Confusing Machiavelli with Machiavellianism is like blaming Darwin for social Darwinism. It ignores the difference between a thinker who describes how the world works and those who twist his ideas to justify oppression. Machiavelli never defended tyranny as an ideal model. When we read his discourses, we find an author passionate about republican freedom, who values institutional balance, citizen participation, and the need to control the abuses of the powerful. He writes, for example, "Corruption in institutions begins when the laws are no longer respected." Does a person who says that sound like someone promoting chaos, or someone trying to preserve a just order against despotism? When Niccolò Machiavelli starts writing about politics at the beginning of the 16th century, he does something radically new. Not by inventing power, power already existed, with all its force, violence, and complexity. What he does is deeper. He breaks with centuries of idealist thinking that tried to understand politics based on what it should be, instead of what it really is. By doing that, Machiavelli doesn't just shock his own time, he creates a new way of thinking, a political philosophy centered on experience, history, and the real games of power. That's why he's rightly seen as the ultimate political realist. But what does it actually mean to be a realist in politics? And why is that such a deep break with the earlier tradition? For many centuries, the major political thinkers in the West were, above all, idealists. For Plato, for example, the visible world, the world of actual political life, was just an imperfect shadow of an ideal world. In the Republic, he imagines a city ruled by philosophers, where justice, harmony, and wisdom are the foundations of government. Politics, for Plato, should reflect the perfect order of the world of ideas. Centuries later, St. Augustine Christianizes this idealism. In The City of God, Augustine contrasts the earthly city, full of passions, pride, and corruption, with the heavenly city, ruled by divine love. Real politics, for him, can only be just if it is subordinated to God's will. Rulers must be humble, obedient to divine plans, and act according to the moral principles of Christian faith. Both thinkers, despite their differences, share something essential: the belief that politics is only legitimate when it's guided by some higher ideal, whether that's reason or God. A good city isn't the one that simply works, but the one that reflects a moral order beyond this world. It's in this context that Machiavelli appears as a historical rupture. Instead of asking what politics should be, he asks how it actually works. Instead of imagining perfect cities, he examines the mistakes, successes, and vices of real rulers. He's not trying to design a utopian regime. He wants to understand the concrete mechanisms of power. There is such a great distance between how men live and how they ought to live, that anyone who gives up what is done for what ought to be done learns more quickly how to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. This sentence is a turning point. It marks Machiavelli's refusal to follow the idealist path. He's not interested in how a good prince should behave in theory. He's interested in how an effective prince actually acts to gain and keep power. That doesn't mean he celebrates evil. It means he adopts a new method, political realism. Machiavelli's realism is, above all, a way of analyzing things. He starts from the empirical observation of history, wars, republics, and empires. Instead of starting with absolute values, he starts with concrete facts. He studies ancient Rome, the Italian kingdoms, the mistakes of recent rulers. He watches how alliances are made and broken, how fear moves the masses, how fortuna, luck, chance, interferes with plans, and how virtù, the leader's ability and skill, can make a difference in decisive moments. In other words, Machiavelli doesn't write like a moralist or a prophet. He writes like an anatomist of power. His realism is a commitment to look at the world as it is, even when it hurts, even when it's uncomfortable. Because only by understanding the real world is it possible to change it. People often confuse political realism with cynicism, But there's a crucial difference. The cynic believes the world is evil by nature and nothing is worth it. A realist like Machiavelli recognizes the limits of abstract morality, but still believes it's possible to govern effectively, and even justly, as long as you understand the real conditions of power. Machiavelli doesn't teach cruelty for cruelty's sake. On the contrary, he criticizes rulers who use violence constantly and unnecessarily. In The Prince, he says that if violence is unavoidable, it should be used all at once and then stopped, so order can be restored and people's trust can be preserved. That shows his realism is pragmatic, not sadistic. He also warns against relying too much on luck, fortuna, and says the ruler should develop his virtue, understood as the ability to act with intelligence, courage, and initiative. That reveals an ethical dimension, even if it's not a traditional moral one. The good ruler is the one who knows how to balance cunning with prudence, strength with sensitivity to the context. His big innovation isn't that he denies values, it's that he changes the main question. Instead of asking, what is the good, he asks, what works? That's not giving up on the good, it's recognizing that, in politics, the good can only be achieved if it's backed by effective strategies. This practical ethics anticipates ideas that would later appear in thinkers like Max Weber, who distinguishes between an ethics of conviction, acting according to your principles, and an ethics of responsibility, acting while taking consequences seriously. Machiavelli is a forerunner of this ethics of responsibility. He doesn't accept that good intentions are enough. He wants to know, what is the real impact of political decisions? Who benefits? Who gets hurt? What risks are being taken? Machiavelli's realism demands courage. It's easier to live in perfect ideas. It's more comfortable to believe that good always wins, that just leaders always prevail, that the wicked always fall. But history, unfortunately, doesn't support that belief. Machiavelli invites us to drop that naivety. He wants us to look at politics with our eyes wide open, without filters, not because he despises ideals, but because he knows that no ideal survives without strategic intelligence. Those who win are never asked how they won. That's a hard truth, but it's real. And that's exactly what makes Machiavelli so relevant today. Instead of telling us what we want to hear, he tells us what we need to understand if we want to act with clarity. Paradoxically, it's this realism that allows Machiavelli to defend freedom. In his discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, he praises republics that manage to balance the interests of the powerful and the people. He defends institutions that restrain abuses, distribute power, and allow political conflict as a driver of renewal. That means that for him, freedom doesn't come from idealism. It comes from deep knowledge of reality. Only by understanding the mechanisms of power can we build stable regimes, avoid corruption, limit tyrants, and protect citizens. So calling Machiavelli a political realist isn't an insult. It's recognizing his originality. He had the courage to break with centuries of idealist thought and create a philosophy that invites us to see the world as it is. Not so we can give up, but so we can act more effectively, more intelligently, and maybe even more justly. Among all the concepts developed by Machiavelli, two stand out as the pillars of his political thinking, virtù and fortuna. If you really want to understand what he taught about power, you need to grasp this tension, maybe the most fascinating part of his entire philosophy. These two terms aren't just old Italian words, they represent two fundamental principles of human life and politics. On one side, our ability to act with intelligence and strength in the face of life. On the other, the weight of chance, luck, and everything that's outside our control. When Machiavelli talks about virtù and fortuna, he's basically dealing with one of the oldest questions in philosophy. How much of our lives, and our governments, is in our own hands? And how much is driven by forces we can't predict or control? What is virtù according to Machiavelli? The term virtù is one of the most misunderstood ideas in Machiavelli's thought. Many people simply translate it as virtue, but that's misleading if you understand it in the Christian or moralistic sense. Machiavelli is not talking about kindness or purity of heart. He's talking about something closer to active excellence, the ability to act effectively, with strength of character in times of crisis. Virtù is a mix of courage, cunning, strategic intelligence, determination, and adaptability. A ruler with virtù is not someone who just wants to do good. It's someone who knows how to act firmly in unstable times, who makes tough decisions when needed, and who shapes reality instead of simply being shaped by it. Look at how he describes this kind of leader in The Prince. I think it's true that fortune controls half of our actions, but leaves the other half, or almost that, for us to govern ourselves. Here, Machiavelli is saying, yes, the world is unpredictable, but that's not an excuse to do nothing. Whoever has virtù faces fortuna head-on. Examples of virtù show up all the time in his work. One of the most famous is Cesare Borgia, who, according to Machiavelli, knew how to use cruelty in a calculated way to restore order in Romagna. It's not exactly praise for authoritarianism, but a recognition of strategic effectiveness in turbulent times. In other moments, he praises figures like Philip of Macedon and Romulus, who, even starting from weak positions, managed to create lasting political structures thanks to their exceptional ability. The point is clear. People with virtù shape events with intelligence and courage. And that, in Machiavelli's view, is real greatness. And what is fortuna? If virtù represents human action, fortuna represents everything that escapes our control. In Latin, fortuna already meant luck, chance, fate. Machiavelli keeps that meaning, but gives it almost mythological force. Fortuna in his work is a blind, unstable, powerful force that can lift a ruler up or destroy him in a matter of days. It stands for everything that makes politics unpredictable. An unexpected crisis, a betrayal, a war, a plague, an opportunity that suddenly appears or disappears without warning. In a famous passage from The Prince, Machiavelli compares fortuna to a violent river that, when it overflows, wipes out everything in its path, but that, if contained by dams and barriers, can be managed. I compare fortune to one of those raging rivers that, when they flood, sweep through the plains, tear down trees, destroy houses, strip soil from one place, and deposit it in another. But even though they're like that, it doesn't mean that, when they are calm, people can't prepare against them with dikes and embankments. The message is powerful. We can't eliminate fortuna, but we can prepare for it. And that's exactly what separates great leaders from fragile ones: the ability to foresee, to act, to adapt, and to stand firm when fate hits hard. The tension between virtù and fortuna. The heart of Machiavelli's philosophy is this constant tension between virtù and fortuna. No one controls everything, but no one is completely at the mercy of chance either. There is always some room to act, and it's in that space that politics happens. This view is deeply human. It recognizes that public life, just like personal life, is made of choices and uncertainty. Governing well for Machiavelli is not about following some ideal model. It's about steering through the rough waters of reality with intelligence. That's why he values adaptability so much. A leader who always acts the same way, whether out of stubbornness or rigid conviction, is doomed to fail when the situation changes. A ruler with virtù is someone who changes with circumstances, who knows how to be both lion and fox, firm or flexible, depending on the moment. The man who wants to act good in all situations is bound to fall among so many who are not good. This is a direct criticism of moral idealism, but also a warning. In politics, virtue isn't purity, it's adaptability. A ruler can't be a slave to fixed formulas. He has to look at the situation, weigh the risks, and act wisely. What Machiavelli teaches us with virtù and fortuna is not just a political theory. It's a philosophy of action in uncertain times. In a world like ours, full of political instability, economic crises, technological changes, and climate risks, the tension between what we control and what we don't is everywhere. We live surrounded by our own fortuna, unpredictable elections, pandemics, sudden market shifts, international conflicts. But we also have, as individuals and as societies, the ability to act with virtù, to plan, to resist, to adapt, to transform. In that sense, Machiavelli isn't just talking to princes from his time, he's talking to all of us. Virtù isn't just for rulers, it's for anyone who refuses to be passive in the face of chaos. And fortuna isn't just a political idea, it's a symbol of the human condition itself. To live is to constantly deal with the unpredictable. Very few works in the history of political philosophy have been as misunderstood as The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. For centuries, the book has been read as a cold, immoral handbook for power-hungry dictators, a Machiavellian guide, in the worst sense of the word, on how to deceive, manipulate, dominate, and, if needed, oppress. But even though that reading is popular, it's deeply unfair and dishonest about what the author was really trying to do. To understand The Prince clearly, you have to go beyond the surface and dive into the historical context in which it was written, Machiavelli's political intentions, and above all, his realistic view of power. When you do that, The Prince stops looking like some plan for tyrants to take over and starts to reveal what it really is. A pragmatic treatise, born out of both despair and hope, aimed at stability, order, and saving a country that was falling apart. The Prince was written in 1513, while Machiavelli was in forced exile. Just 2 years earlier, he had held the position of Secretary of the Second Chancery of the Florentine Republic, responsible for diplomatic missions and political analysis. But when the Republic fell and the Medici family returned to power, Machiavelli was fired, accused of conspiracy, arrested, tortured, and eventually released. But banned from politics. Thrown out of the game he loved most, Machiavelli withdrew to the countryside, broken and forgotten. It was in this moment of isolation and defeat that he wrote his most famous work. The Prince is born not out of a desire to dominate, but out of the frustration of being blocked from serving his city. It's a book written by a defeated man who was still passionately political. Someone who wanted to return to the center of power, even if that meant offering his knowledge to the new ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici. But the book is more than an attempt to get his job back. It's an urgent response to a national crisis. Italy at the time was fragmented, weak, and invaded by foreign powers, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Each city-state, like Florence, Venice, Milan, or Rome, looked out only for itself, with no unity or common defense. The Pope acted more like a warlord than a spiritual leader. Corruption was everywhere. Loyalties were fragile. The country was literally being torn apart. It's in this context that Machiavelli shouts, in the very last line of The Prince, this barbarous domination of foreigners must make some Italian soul burn with indignation. That line almost never shows up in the simplified readings of the book, but it reveals the heart of the text. Machiavelli wanted Italy to be unified. He wanted a strong ruler, capable of imposing order where there was chaos, ending the internal divisions and driving out foreign invaders. The Prince is not, then, an invitation to tyranny. It's a call to action, a patriotic cry, written with bitterness and frustration, but also with clarity. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli isn't designing utopias or ideal systems. He doesn't map out a perfect state. Instead, he offers advice based on real cases taken from ancient history and from his own time, explaining how a ruler can seize, keep, and strengthen power. He talks about alliances, wars, betrayals, strategies, and yes, about the use of fear and force, but always with one goal in mind: to prevent collapse and preserve power in an effective way. Here's the point most people miss. For Machiavelli, the worst possible scenario is not an authoritarian government. It's anarchy, instability, civil war, looting, foreign occupation, the breakdown of order. Those are the real horrors. That's why he sees political authority as a necessary good, and if hard decisions have to be made to ensure the state's survival, then so be it. That doesn't mean he celebrates violence. In fact, Machiavelli says, force must be used with restraint, with calculation, and only when it's truly necessary. In a famous passage, he writes, "Injuries should be inflicted all at once, so that, being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits should be granted little by little, so that they may be better savoured." A line like that often shocks people, but it shouldn't be read as a justification for cruelty. It's an observation about how human emotions work, and about how a ruler can avoid long-lasting hatred. The goal is not sadism, it's effectiveness. And for Machiavelli, political effectiveness is the foundation of lasting justice. Calling the prince a manual for tyranny is as shallow as calling an anatomy chart a defense of suffering just because it shows injured organs. Machiavelli isn't promoting tyranny. He's explaining how tyrants act, how states fall apart, and what can be done to avoid disaster. It's also important to remember, Machiavelli wrote discourses on Livy where he openly praises republics, defends popular participation, criticizes corruption, and celebrates freedom as a political value. In other words, he was not, at his core, an unconditional defender of absolute monarchy. He was a realist, and he knew that, in that specific moment of Italian history, only a strong central power could bring order. If he had been writing for a stable republic, he would have written a different book, but he wrote The Prince because his country was falling apart. Another key point, the goal of a ruler, according to Machiavelli, shouldn't simply be staying in power at any cost, but achieving political glory, the kind that lives on in history and is remembered as greatness. Machiavelli has no interest in mediocre leaders or petty oppressors. He admires those who manage to build something lasting, who create order where there was disorder, who restore the dignity of a people. That kind of glory doesn't come from cruelty, but from the ability to act with virtù in the face of fortuna, like we saw in the previous section. The reason The Prince still shocks people today is that it forces us to face politics as it is, not as we wish it were. He says, very clearly, that appearances matter, that power depends on perception, and that private morality can't be naively applied to public morality. That's uncomfortable, but it's also freeing. Because when Machiavelli rips away the mask of hypocrisy, he allows us to think about politics with more maturity, responsibility, and attention to consequences. His pragmatism is not a lack of values, it's an invitation to a realistic sense of responsibility. It's almost ironic that Machiavelli is remembered only as the author of The Prince, as if he had dedicated his life to teaching rulers how to strengthen their personal power. What most people don't know, and what completely changes his image, is that his most robust, deep, and politically free-minded work is not The Prince, but discourses on the first 10 books of Livy. And it's in this book that Machiavelli reveals his real political preference, the Republic. Yes, Machiavelli was a Republican, and not just because he worked for years in the administration of the Florentine Republic. He believed, with historical and philosophical conviction, that well-organized republics are the best type of regime to guarantee freedom, stability, and lasting greatness for a people. In this section, we're going to understand why the Republic was Machiavelli's preferred political model, and why this side of his thought is still so ignored, even though it's absolutely central. In Discourses on Livy, written between 1513 and 1519, Machiavelli analyzes the history of ancient Rome to draw lessons for the politics of his own time. He doesn't write like a classic historian, just describing events. He writes like a political thinker. He wants to understand what made Rome grow, endure, and flourish, and also what led to its decline. And his conclusion is clear. Rome's strength came from its republican institutions. For Machiavelli, the Roman Republic managed to balance social tensions between the people and the nobles, created checks and balances, valued public debate, and turned conflict into a driving force for political renewal. He writes, "Freedom is born from the constant struggle between the people and the great." That line sums up his view well. Class conflict isn't something to be avoided. It's something that needs to be institutionalized, controlled, and channeled toward the common good. The Republic, in this sense, isn't a regime of total peace, but a regime that organizes instability in a productive way so it doesn't turn into chaos or absolute domination. For Machiavelli, one of the greatest strengths of a republic is that it doesn't depend only on the virtue of a single person. Unlike a principality, which can collapse if the ruler is weak or corrupt, a republic rests on long-lasting institutions, well-built laws, and the ongoing participation of its citizens. That institutional structure is what protects freedom and prevents abuse. Machiavelli understands that power, by its very nature, tends to go too far, which is why it needs to be surrounded by constraints: courts, councils, magistrates, the Senate, popular assemblies. All of these exist to spread power out and stop it from concentrating dangerously in one pair of hands. In the discourses, he repeatedly praises the wisdom of the Romans in mixing the three classic elements of government: the monarchical, the consuls, the aristocratic, the Senate, and the democratic, the people's tribunes. This mixed form of government was, for him, the most balanced and the most resilient in times of crisis. Where there are no firm laws, there can be no freedom. This simple, direct statement shows how Machiavelli saw the role of law not as an external burden, but as a guarantee of collective freedom. Popular participation, an antidote to corruption. Another key element of the Republic for Machiavelli is popular participation. He believed that citizens must be involved in political life not just as subjects, but as active agents of the Republic. For that, you need civic virtue, a sense of duty, vigilance against abuse, and a willingness to serve the common good. Machiavelli knew that corruption is a constant threat, and that it doesn't come only from those at the top, but also from the apathy of the people. When citizens stop caring about politics, stop watching their leaders, stop engaging in public debate, stop defending the laws, that's when the Republic starts to rot. That's why he saw active popular participation as vital for the health of a republic. That doesn't mean he idealized the people. Machiavelli knew that crowds can be volatile, impulsive, even cruel. But he also believed that, taken as a whole, the people tend to make fewer mistakes than a single ruler. In his view, the masses are more cautious than princes. The people are more prudent, more constant, and wiser than princes. That statement is revealing and completely incompatible with the image of Machiavelli as a defender of tyranny. Here, he clearly stands with the people against concentrated power. If there was something Machiavelli truly feared, it was unchecked tyranny. In his works, he doesn't hold back when criticizing rulers who, driven by personal ambition, ignore institutions, trample laws, and rule through constant fear. For him, the tyrant is the one who refuses to be constrained by anything or anyone, and that makes him unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. In a tyrannical government, fear replaces trust, flattery replaces criticism, and truth is suffocated by propaganda. Machiavelli knew that regimes like that can last for a while, but they eventually collapse. Without institutional support and without real popular legitimacy, the tyrant ends up surrounded by enemies and by flattering courtiers who will betray him when it's convenient. In the discourses, he constantly warns about the dangers of letting one man accumulate too much power, and he firmly defends the idea that the common good can only be protected when there are real limits on personal power. Anyone who wants to establish a republic must assume that all men are bad, and that they will always act according to their evil nature whenever they have the chance. This pessimistic view of human nature doesn't lead Machiavelli to cynicism, but to institutional wisdom. If power corrupts, then you have to build mechanisms to keep that corruption in check. That's what a republic is for. Reading The Prince in isolation is like looking only at the tip of an iceberg. Machiavelli's real passion was with free republics, well-organized governments, strong institutions, and active citizens. He was a Republican patriot, an admirer of ancient Rome, and a defender of freedom as a political value. His criticism of moralistic idealism doesn't make him amoral. It just shows that, for him, politics has to be effective to be just. And that applies to republics too. They don't survive on good intentions alone. They need laws, structure, civic virtue, and constant vigilance. One of the most unfair judgments in the history of political thought is the idea that Machiavelli didn't believe in morality. For centuries, his critics, religious writers, moralists, romantics, accused him of promoting cruelty, deceit, egoism, and unlimited power. The label stuck. Machiavelli became the supposed apostle of political immorality. But that accusation comes from a simplified, and worse, mistaken, reading of his work. In reality, Machiavelli was never immoral. What he did was something more courageous and more uncomfortable. He separated traditional morality from political morality. Instead of applying the principles of private life directly to government, he recognized that politics works with its own logic, its own demands, its own risks and responsibilities that don't fit neatly inside the framework of personal virtue. By doing this, Machiavelli doesn't destroy morality, he rebuilds it on a new ground, tougher, more complex, and more human. And it's this kind of ethics, often misunderstood, that we're dealing with here. For Machiavelli, the big tragedy of the political thinking of his time, and of many times, honestly, was the belief that the principles that guide private life automatically apply to public life. That a good father will always be a good ruler. That absolute honesty works the same way at home and on the battlefield. That someone who acts charitably in their personal life can simply apply that same charity to running a city or a state. This idea, deeply Christian and still dominant in the Renaissance, starts from the belief that morality is universal and indivisible. Machiavelli, on the other hand, looks at the real world and notices that, in politics, always acting like a good man can lead to ruin, not just for the ruler, but for the whole people. A prince, if he wants to maintain his power, must learn how not to be good all the time. That line sounds cynical, but it points to a crucial distinction. It's not that Machiavelli rejects goodness, but that he knows absolute goodness can be disastrous in a world full of ambition, betrayal, and conflict. In other words, there are moments in politics when a ruler has to make tough, unpopular, and even morally questionable decisions, not out of vanity or cruelty, but to protect a greater good. And that greater good for Machiavelli is stability, security, and the preservation of the state. This is where one of the most important ideas for understanding Machiavelli's view of morality comes in: the ethics of responsibility. Many centuries after Machiavelli, the sociologist Max Weber would revisit this idea and contrast it with what he called the ethics of conviction. The ethics of conviction says, I act according to what is right, no matter the outcome. The ethics of responsibility asks, what will the consequences of my actions be? Machiavelli, without using these exact terms, had already defended this view. For him, a ruler can't afford to act only based on his personal conscience. He has to think about the real impact of his decisions on the community. And that often requires hard choices. Choices a private morality wouldn't be able to tolerate. In the actions of men, and especially of princes, where there is no court of appeal, we judge by the result. This idea of judging by results is not a defense of evil. It's a way of affirming practical responsibility. Machiavelli knew that in politics, good intentions are not enough, and that a well-intentioned but ineffective ruler can be more dangerous than a tough but prudent one. That leads us to a key question. What is a good ruler for Machiavelli? The answer may be surprising. A good ruler is not someone who never lies, never deceives, never harms, but someone who knows when to do these things, how to do them, and why. The prince's virtue lies in his ability to act according to necessity, without losing sight of the common good. Of course, this view doesn't fit inside traditional moral handbooks. It's uncomfortable, full of tension and dilemmas. But it's realistic. Machiavelli sees politics as a tragic arena where there are often no clean choices and where the ruler has to decide between two evils, trying to choose the lesser one. He doesn't celebrate cruelty, he rejects naivety. For him, the worst moral failure a ruler can commit is refusing to do what needs to be done because he's afraid of looking bad. In the end, the one who suffers isn't him, it's the people. If we want to understand the kind of morality Machiavelli proposes, we might call it an ethics of clarity, an ethics that doesn't deny values but puts them to the test of reality, an ethics that accepts that, in normal times, you can govern gently, but that also recognizes that exceptional times demand exceptional decisions. This is a lesson he learned by looking at history. In discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, he analyzes the Roman Republic and shows that, in times of crisis, the city had to suspend some freedoms to survive. For example, the creation of a temporary dictatorship was an emergency measure, harsh but necessary. That doesn't mean abandoning morality. It means adapting it to the time, the context, the urgency. And doing that takes wisdom, not coldness. Maybe Machiavelli's deepest criticism isn't aimed at morality itself, but at moral hypocrisy, the kind that cynically uses virtuous speeches to hide corrupt actions, that talks about justice while exploiting people, that promises freedom while stripping away rights. That leans on the image of the good ruler while governing only for his own interests. Machiavelli wants to expose that game. He believes it's better to be honest about the limits of politics than to pretend a purity that doesn't exist. Instead of painting an idealized picture, he shows us how power really moves and what it takes to keep it from becoming oppression. That's why his moral philosophy still bothers people so much. It pulls us out of our comfort zone. It forces us to think about what we would do in hard situations. It asks us, would you stick to your principles if it meant thousands of people might die? Would you let your city fall just to avoid dirtying your hands? Would you refuse to act harshly even knowing it would save your people? These are brutal questions, and Machiavelli doesn't give easy answers, but he gives us a framework to think through them. And in that sense, his morality is demanding. It requires courage, historical awareness, responsibility, and above all, the courage to choose with maturity. Modern political philosophy starts with an act of rupture. And maybe no thinker broke more boldly with the foundations of the past than Machiavelli, when he said, clearly and with arguments, that politics cannot be guided by Christian morality, at a time when politics and religion still walked hand in hand, when kings ruled by divine right, and popes held both spiritual and military power. Machiavelli dared to say that governing people has to follow a logic different from the logic of saving souls. For his time, that was an intellectual bomb. With this move, he didn't just offend religious dogmas. He opened the door to a new way of seeing the political world. A secular, pragmatic, strategic view, a view that looked at facts, not commandments. That judged rulers by their results, not by their piety. This was, without a doubt, one of Machiavelli's biggest contributions to the history of political thought. But to really understand how deep this transformation was, we first need to understand the world Machiavelli lived in, and the world he was arguing against. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christianity was the moral and institutional foundation of the West. The Catholic Church not only shaped people's individual consciences, it also shaped political structures. The Pope crowned kings, mediated treaties, excommunicated political enemies, justified wars, and set the boundaries of what was just or unjust. Politics was, in many ways, an arm of theology. In that model, the ideal ruler was the Christian prince, just, devout, humble, obedient to God's command. Virtues like charity, forgiveness, patience, and love of neighbor, all valid in the spiritual realm, were seen as desirable qualities for a political leader too. Saving the soul and governing the city seemed, if not unified, at least tightly connected. But Machiavelli looked at the reality of Italy and saw something completely different. He saw corrupt popes like Alexander VI and Julius II waging wars, playing with alliances, and expanding their temporal power like feudal warlords. He saw princes using religion as a tool of manipulation. And above all, he saw a population trained in submission, passivity, and resignation, the result of centuries of Christian indoctrination. He positioned himself firmly against this scenario. For Machiavelli, politics has its own logic. And that logic is not aimed at spiritual salvation, but at maintaining order, stability, and collective security. Christian morality, which preaches unconditional forgiveness, humility in the face of suffering, and reward in the afterlife, is incompatible with the concrete demands of political power, which often require quick action, courage, tough decisions, and even the calculated use of force. That's why he writes in The Prince. And how many times have preachers urged Christian princes to live like Christ? And all they achieved was to weaken states and leave them open to invasion. In other words, Machiavelli harshly criticizes the naive attempt to simply transfer Christian ethics into politics. He doesn't despise personal faith, but he insists that a ruler cannot behave like a saint in a world full of wolves. Politics demands strength, not submission, cunning, not naivety, firmness, not softness, and none of these qualities were celebrated by the dominant Christian tradition of his time. Religion as a political tool, not a moral GPS. Another central point in Machiavelli is his criticism of how the powerful use religion as a tool. He clearly sees how many rulers use religious language not out of real faith, but as a way to control people, create symbolic unity, and legitimize their power. Nothing is more praiseworthy than pretending to have moral qualities you don't actually possess. For men, in general, judge more by what they see than by what they touch. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few feel what you really are. Here, Machiavelli is showing how religion can be used as a mask of virtue, a thin coat of morality covering raw ambition. Many princes talk about God, justice, and charity, but act guided by power, conquest, and convenience. For him, it's better to have a ruler who openly accepts the toughness needed to keep order than one who fakes goodness while ruling with hypocrisy. This perspective, still uncomfortable today, was seen as blasphemous back then. Not by accident, The Prince was placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books, exactly because it exposed the power games hiding behind religious appearances. Another point of tension between Machiavelli and Christianity is his rejection of the pacifism preached by Jesus and the Gospels. For him, the idea that suffering ennobles, that forgiveness should be given 70 times 7, that the kingdom is not of this world, all of that, while noble on a spiritual level, is harmful to a people's political strength. In the Discourses, Machiavelli directly compares ancient Roman religion with Christianity. He says that while the Romans celebrated courage, sacrifice for the homeland, honor, and glory, Christianity emphasized humility, renunciation, contemplation, and contempt for earthly goods. As a result, Christian citizens became less active in defending their political freedom. The religion of the ancients glorified brave men. Ours glorifies contemplative men. This, according to Machiavelli, weakened the civic spirit of the Italians. Christianity promoted an ethic of submission, while politics requires an ethic of action. A people who expect their reward in heaven tend to endure injustice on earth, and that is exactly what a tyrant wants. It's important to be clear. Machiavelli was not an atheist in the modern sense. He never outright denied God's existence, nor did he call for people to abandon faith. What he proposed was more subtle and far more radical, that religion should be treated as a political phenomenon, not as an absolute guide for state action. He recognized that religion can have value as a force of social cohesion. A strong religion can inspire courage, loyalty, and discipline, but it only does that well when it serves politics, not when it stands above it. In this sense, Machiavelli anticipated many modern debates about secular states, separation of church and state, and freedom of conscience. He is one of the early voices arguing to separate altar and sword, faith and law, salvation and government. He understood that mixing them can be fatal for freedom and for religion itself. Ever since it was written, The Prince has caused discomfort, scandal, and fascination. For centuries, people read it as a handbook of political cynicism, and Machiavelli's work was labeled immoral, demonic, and dangerous. But there's a line of interpretation, controversial but intriguing, that suggests something surprising. What if The Prince is actually a satire? What if Machiavelli wasn't teaching the powerful how to rule with cunning and cruelty, but instead exposing, with irony, the absurdity and violence of unchecked power? This idea, even though it's not the most common reading, has gained strength over the centuries, especially among scholars who pay attention to the ambiguity of the text and the political context in which it was written. In this lesson, we're going to explore that theory. Not to say it's the only truth, but to show how The Prince is a much more ambiguous, complex and provocative work than it seems at first glance. On the surface, The Prince looks like a straightforward practical guide on how to gain and hold power. Machiavelli describes political strategies, analyzes the behavior of real rulers, justifies the use of force and manipulation, and even says it's better to be feared than loved. All of this helped build its dark reputation. But when we look more closely, something strange appears. The tone of the text, in several passages, feels exaggerated, almost theatrical. The cold way Machiavelli describes certain cruel actions doesn't sound natural. His praise for figures like Cesare Borgia, known for his brutality, feels forced. The formulas of power he lays out are so harsh and calculating that many readers start to wonder, is he really being serious? That doubt isn't new. Since the 18th century, thinkers and critics have raised the possibility that The Prince might be an ironic work, maybe even a pamphlet against tyranny disguised as a guide for tyrants. One of the first to suggest this was the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. For Rousseau, The Prince was a book for republicans. According to him, Machiavelli wrote it not to teach princes how to rule, but to show the people how princes behave, and, by doing that, encourage resistance. In this sense, it would be an educational book for the oppressed, not for the oppressors. Centuries later, modern scholars like Isaiah Berlin and Quentin Skinner picked up this reading again, highlighting the ambiguity and strategic silences in Machiavelli. They point out that the text never clearly says the author approves of the actions he describes. Machiavelli reports, narrates, analyzes, but almost never passes moral judgment, and that opens the door to multiple interpretations. On top of that, when we place The Prince side by side with the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livius, the contradiction seems striking. How can the same author who praises the civic virtues of the Roman Republic and criticizes the dangers of tyranny also advise princes to rule with an iron fist? One possible answer: maybe he never really advised them. Maybe he only pretended to. If we read The Prince as satire, it can be seen as a fierce critique of absolute power, but written under the mask of a loyal advisor. By exaggerating methods of domination, by portraying the ideal ruler as cold, manipulative, violent, and deceitful, Machiavelli might actually be caricaturing power itself, revealing its darkest and most undesirable face. In that scenario, a careful reader, especially one with Republican values, wouldn't feel admiration, but disgust. They would see the Machiavellian prince as an example of what should be avoided, not what should be copied. This interpretation becomes even more plausible when we remember the political situation in which Machiavelli wrote The Prince. He was in exile, without public office, pushed to the margins after the fall of the Florentine Republic and the return of the Medici to power. By dedicating the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, Machiavelli might have been trying to win his way back into politics, or, according to this line of thought, only pretending to submit, while secretly writing a subtle, corrosive text, an intellectual Trojan horse. Another point that feeds the satire hypothesis is the language of the work itself. Machiavelli is ambiguous by nature. His texts are never completely clear, and he often avoids explicit moral judgment. He describes political actions with a detachment that can be read as neutrality or as irony. Some passages in The Prince also feel deliberately provocative. When he says the prince must learn how not to be good, or when people summarize his thinking as the ends justify the means, even though that exact phrase doesn't appear in the text, it captures its essence. It almost feels like Machiavelli is testing the reader, challenging them to either accept the argument or reject it with outrage. This technique, which some scholars call a double voice, lets the author say two things at the same time. One for those who read on the surface, and another for those who read carefully. That supports the idea that The Prince is not a simple manual, but a coded text written in dangerous times, when being too direct could cost a person their life. What if it's both? Still, it's important to admit, not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Many scholars argue that The Prince really is a serious, pragmatic treatise written for a real ruler in a time of crisis. They claim its cold tone is simply the result of Machiavelli's radical realism, his refusal to romanticize politics. The tension between these two readings, one literal and one satirical, doesn't necessarily need to be resolved once and for all. In fact, it might be that Machiavelli wrote The Prince with both layers built in, one that is practical, visible, and strategic, and another that is critical, hidden, and only accessible to more attentive readers. That wouldn't be out of character for him. After all, Machiavelli was a man of politics, and politics by nature is a game of masks, indirect messages, and ambiguous language. No matter which interpretation you prefer, one thing is clear. The Prince is an open, dense, ambiguous work, and that's exactly why it never stops being read. Its power isn't just in what it says, but in how it makes us feel and think. It provokes, challenges, confuses, and unsettles. Machiavelli doesn't hand us easy answers. He forces us to think, to doubt, to interpret. And maybe that's the true genius of the book. It turns us into political readers. It invites us not to trust appearances, to look beyond the surface, to even distrust the author himself. The Prince, whether you read it as satire or as a treatise, is a brutal mirror of power. And like every mirror, it reflects not only the image of the other, but also our own. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. With this line from chapter 17 of The Prince, Machiavelli cemented his reputation, unfairly, as a counselor of tyrants. For many quick readers, that sentence alone was enough to put him on history's defendant bench, a defender of brutality, oppression, and fear as legitimate tools of government. But that's a shallow reading. Taken out of context, this phrase loses its real meaning and feeds the distorted image of Machiavelli as some apostle of violence. In this lesson, we're going to put that idea back into context and show how he is not defending the careless use of force, but presenting a pragmatic and surprisingly moderate view of when and how fear and violence can be used in politics and with what limits. First, let's understand the context in which Machiavelli wrote. The Prince was written in 1513, as we've seen, during a moment of deep crisis in Italy. Political instability, internal wars, foreign invasions, and a near-total collapse of institutions. Chaos was the norm. In that setting, Machiavelli was trying to advise a ruler, a new prince, capable of restoring order and unifying the Italian states. The question driving Machiavelli is, how can power be kept stable and effective in the face of human unpredictability and weak institutions? His answer is realistic, not idealized. And within that answer sits the famous line, "It is better to be feared than loved." But he doesn't stop there. The full idea, which people often ignore, is this. Nevertheless, the prince must make himself feared in such a way that if he is not loved, at least he avoids being hated. In other words, fear can be useful, but hatred is dangerous. The line between ruling with authority and ruling with cruelty is thin, and Machiavelli is fully aware of that. What he really argues is that a ruler cannot rely only on the love of the people, because love is unstable. It depends on interests, expectations, and changing circumstances. Fear, when used carefully, is more constant. It discourages actions against the ruler, helps prevent rebellions, and sets boundaries. But fear, for Machiavelli, must not be absolute or out of control. He rejects arbitrary violence, the kind that comes from anger, revenge, or emotional imbalance. He says force should only be used when it is truly necessary, and always strategically. Injuries should be inflicted all at once, so that, being felt less, they offend less, and benefits should be granted little by little. This line, often read as pure cynicism, is actually a calculation. If violence is unavoidable to restore order, it should be done quickly and in a concentrated way to avoid dragging out suffering and feeding long-term hatred. Again, the goal is not ruling through terror, but stabilizing power so that the ruler can govern safely and, if possible, fairly. A key point in Machiavelli's thinking is that violence, when used constantly and without restraint, turns back against the ruler. Constant fear eventually turns into hatred, and hatred, unlike fear, fuels revolts, conspiracies, and ongoing instability. That's why Machiavelli insists on something most of his critics ignore. Violence must be limited, calculated, and used mainly to consolidate power at the beginning of a rule. After that, the ruler should govern through laws, institutions, and a balanced political order. Cruelty, if it is permitted to call it that, is well used when it is exercised all at once, out of necessity, and then is not continued, but turned to the greatest possible benefit for the subjects. Here is the core of his view: the difference between useful cruelty and pointless cruelty. The first is the kind that, paradoxically, can prevent something even worse, like civil war, the total collapse of the state, or foreign domination. The second is self-destructive, because it destroys trust, builds resentment, and leaves the ruler constantly under threat. This distinction is deeply ethical, even if it's not based on Christian morality. Machiavelli is interested in an ethics of responsibility, as we saw before. He judges political actions by their consequences, not just by intention. The example of Cesare Borgia, the cruel but effective prince. To explain his view on violence, Machiavelli uses, among others, the example of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI. Borgia was a military and political leader known for his brutality, but also for being able to restore order in Romagna, a region wrecked by crime and disorder. According to Machiavelli, Borgia appointed a harsh governor, Ramiro de Orco, to carry out the punishments needed. Once order was restored, Borgia had him executed in public, as a way to show he did not approve of such cruelty. In doing so, he kept his power, but did not look like a sadist. For Machiavelli, the lesson is clear. An effective ruler is someone who knows when to be tough and when to pull back. Someone who understands the role of fear, but also the danger of pushing it too far. A lot of readers still feel uncomfortable with the idea that it's better to be feared than loved. After all, shouldn't we want governments that inspire loyalty, admiration, and real affection from the people? Machiavelli would agree, in times of peace. But he is writing The Prince in a time of war, betrayal, instability, and crisis. In situations like that, love is a fragile luxury. Fear, when used intelligently, may be the only thing standing between a state and total collapse. That doesn't mean the ruler should reject love. Machiavelli is just warning, if you're forced to choose between being loved and being feared, choose fear. But never hatred. That's the hard balance, but it's necessary. In the end, what Machiavelli is really trying to do is describe the hidden rules of politics. He isn't saying we have to like harshness. He's forcing us to recognize that it exists, and that it plays a role in building and maintaining power. Ignoring that reality can actually be more dangerous than accepting it with clear eyes. Ruling often means choosing between two evils. And for Machiavelli, the lesser evil is using force with restraint to avoid total chaos. This is not a celebration of authoritarianism. It's a recognition that authority, when it's no longer respected, sometimes has to be reasserted, even harshly. So when Machiavelli says it's better to be feared than loved, he's not glorifying violence. He's opening a serious discussion about what power is built on. He's saying that love can fail, but fear, when carefully managed, can hold things together. It's a hard lesson, yes, but it's also a lesson in political maturity. Because, as always, Machiavelli isn't writing to comfort us. He's writing to make us think seriously about the world as it really is. Throughout history, Machiavelli's image has often been tied to ideas of manipulation, domination, and immoral power. But if we read his work carefully and without prejudice, we see something surprising. Machiavelli's goal wasn't to teach people how to gain power at any cost. He wanted more than that. He wanted something bigger, harder, and more lasting. He wanted to teach how to achieve political glory. And what is this glory, according to Machiavelli? It's not shallow fame. It's not instant success. It's not being feared or flattered. Glory for him is the historical recognition of those who knew how to govern with intelligence, courage, and vision, and who, because of that, left a deep and respectable mark on the world. Glory is the true goal of politics, the thing that lifts a ruler above the simple game of power and writes their name into history. In this lesson, we're going to understand how glory is the moral core of Machiavelli's thinking, and why it demands much more than dominating others. It demands building something. For Machiavelli, holding on to power is not the hard part. Many rulers manage to stay in power through alliances, brute force, or manipulation. But that's not enough. A ruler who just clings to the throne without changing their political reality, without protecting their homeland, without reforming institutions or freeing their people from instability, is not worthy of glory. They're just a survivor. Glory, on the other hand, is earned by those who use power to accomplish great things. That might mean founding a new order, restoring a city's freedom, unifying territories, protecting the weak, or creating lasting laws. Political glory is the result of virtue applied for the benefit of a community and recognized by history. Men should be judged by the greatness of their deeds, not by the purity of their intentions. This line sums up Machiavelli's view. What matters in politics are the concrete effects of actions and whether they endure. Machiavelli doesn't condemn ambition. Unlike Christian or Stoic traditions that see the desire for recognition as vanity or sin, Machiavelli believes that the ambition for glory can be a positive, creative force. When it's directed toward the common good, it pushes rulers to go beyond themselves, to take risks, and to leave a legacy that truly benefits the people. It's important to notice that this glory is not a selfish pursuit. For Machiavelli, true glory can only be achieved when a ruler accomplishes something great that goes beyond their own interests. A despot who rules just to pile up wealth or keep total control is not glorious. They're mediocre. All armed prophets have won, and the unarmed ones have been destroyed. Here, Machiavelli is talking about great political founders, Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, who were able to combine action, authority, and a sense of timing to build new and lasting orders. They are examples of leaders who didn't just try to stay in power, but used power to create something that outlived them. This idea of glory is far from being only symbolic or aesthetic. It plays a central ethical role in Machiavelli's thought. If, as we've seen in earlier lessons, he rejects traditional morality as the only measure in politics, that doesn't mean he is amoral. On the contrary, he offers a new way to measure the value of political action, and that measure is glory. The virtuous prince is not the one who never makes mistakes, but the one whose actions produce order, stability, freedom, or prosperity. Glory, in this sense, is the recognition that a ruler knew how to use power in an intelligent, careful, and effective way, and that their work stood the test of time. This view demands responsibility. It demands calculation. It demands courage. Above all, it demands the ability to resist the temptation to govern only for oneself. Glory doesn't come from ego. It comes from building something bigger than the individual. It's exactly because he values glory as the ultimate goal that Machiavelli rejects arbitrary domination. A ruler who governs through pure brute force, constant intimidation, and total suppression of freedom is not worthy of admiration. They might stay in power for a while, but when they fall, nothing of value remains. Machiavelli clearly despised the corruption of tyrants who rule just to enrich themselves, silence others, and stay protected. For him, these leaders are not just immoral, they're weak. They are unable to create genuine loyalty, to inspire greatness, or to found a stable political order. In the discourses he writes, tyranny is destined to instability, the republic to resistance. True glory, then, doesn't come from repression, but from building solid institutions. It depends on the ability to balance social forces, to cultivate civic freedom, to contain corruption, and to make tough decisions, yes, but always with a long-term vision. Another important point about glory in Machiavelli is that it depends in part on public recognition. In other words, it's not enough to do great things. People need to see them as great. Society and history have to acknowledge them. This isn't just vanity, it's a deep understanding of politics as a space of visibility. A ruler needs to be seen as effective, strong, and fair. Appearances matter because they shape trust, public support, and legitimacy. But it's not about faking virtue. It's about building it through visible actions. This idea connects with the Renaissance ideal of lasting fame, something humanists valued a lot. For Machiavelli, achieving glory is, in a way, a form of becoming immortal through politics. Not out of empty pride, but because it means having contributed to the order of the world. Finally, it's important to say, for Machiavelli, glory is also a way to resist fate, to resist fortuna. As we saw in the lesson on virtù and fortuna, the world is unstable, unpredictable, ruled by chance. But human action, when brave and well-directed, can still transform history. To seek glory is to fight against mediocrity and passivity. It's to refuse the role of spectator and accept the risk of acting. Machiavelli invites us to think about politics not just as defense, but as creation, foundation, and conquest in a higher sense. So, when we read Machiavelli carefully, we see that the ultimate goal of the virtuous ruler is not simply to dominate, it is to leave a mark. To be remembered not for the fear they inspired, but for the institutions they built, the wars they fought for a just cause, the reforms that stabilized their city, the freedom they helped protect. Glory, in this sense, is the highest form of political morality in Machiavelli. It's not easy, it's not automatic, and it's not for everyone. It demands virtù, it demands vision, it demands the courage to go beyond just holding power, and to seek greatness. When we think about revolutions that changed the course of history, like the American Revolution of 1776 or the French Revolution of 1789, the names that usually come to mind are Rousseau, Montesquieu, Locke, or Voltaire. But behind these big modern thinkers, there's a less visible, yet absolutely crucial influence. Machiavelli. Yes, Machiavelli, so often labeled as the thinker of authoritarianism, was also one of the key inspirations behind modern republicanism, the idea of political freedom, resistance to tyranny, and the value of active citizenship. But not the Machiavelli of the Prince read in isolation. The Machiavelli who influenced revolutions is the one from discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy, the thinker passionately committed to free republics and strong institutions. In this lesson, we're going to see how Machiavelli's republican thought crossed centuries, shaped Enlightenment thinkers, and became a core part of the ideas that built modern democracy. It's worth repeating, reducing Machiavelli to the author of The Prince is a historical injustice. Even though that book is more famous and often quoted, his main political work in terms of size and depth is clearly the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy. There, Machiavelli analyzes the history of Republican Rome and defends the idea that political freedom is only possible when there is a balance between social forces, with institutions that limit power and citizens who are engaged in public life. He values law, popular participation, institutional conflict as something productive, and civic virtù, the ability of individuals to put the common good above private interest. For him, freedom is not just the absence of domination, but the possibility for everyone to take part in political life. A free people is one that can resist abuses of power, elect representatives, fight corruption, and help shape the future of their republic. This deeply republican and combative way of thinking was rediscovered with force in the 17th century, and especially in the 18th century, when the world started to question absolute monarchies and imagine new forms of government based on popular sovereignty. For a long time, Machiavelli was read with suspicion, especially because his work had been condemned by the Catholic Church and by moralist thinkers. But starting in the Enlightenment, a new kind of reading emerged, one that saw in Machiavelli not a corrupter of morals, but a clear-eyed analyst of power structures. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, and even James Harrington, one of the fathers of English republicanism, studied Machiavelli's discourses to think about how to found free states based on laws and citizen participation. Rousseau, for example, said, "Machiavelli, while pretending to give lessons to kings, gave great lessons to the people." With that line, Rousseau flips the usual reading of Machiavelli and turns him into an ally of republican freedom. For him, The Prince would be an ironic work that reveals to the people how rulers dominate, while the discourses are a genuine manual of resistance and citizenship. Montesquieu, in turn, took from Machiavelli the idea that you need to balance powers to avoid tyranny. The concept of separating the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, which appears in the spirit of the laws, draws directly from this Machiavellian concern with checks and balances that protect freedom. During the American Revolution, Machiavelli's discourses also played an important role. The founding fathers of the United States, people like James Madison, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, were deeply influenced by classical republicanism, which included Machiavelli alongside Cicero, Polybius, and other Roman thinkers. When drafting the US Constitution, Madison in particular wanted to design a republic that would avoid the concentration of power and protect citizens' freedom through strong institutions, mutual checks, and political representation. All of this lines up closely with the principles Machiavelli defends in the discourses. The Federalist No. 10, written by Madison, echoes one of Machiavelli's central concerns: how to contain corruption and preserve civic virtue in a society full of conflicting interests. For both authors, the answer lies in strengthening institutions, embracing pluralism, and keeping the people engaged. In France, Republican ideas also found a source of inspiration in Machiavelli. In the years leading up to the French Revolution, thinkers like Condorcet, Mirabeau, and Robespierre looked to the ancient republics, especially Rome, as models of civic virtue and commitment to freedom. And Machiavelli was the greatest modern interpreter of that tradition. For the revolutionaries, Machiavelli represented resistance to despotism, the courage to found a new political order based on popular participation, equality before the law, and the fight against tyranny. During the Jacobin phase of the revolution, the idea of civic virtue, which Machiavelli had recovered from the Romans, became an ideal to strive for. Virtue was no longer just a quality of the ruler. It became a moral demand placed on every republican citizen. Of course, revolutionary excesses stained that ideal, especially the use of violence in the name of public virtue. But the key point remains. Machiavelli was read as a thinker of political freedom and transformative action. Machiavelli's influence on revolutions wasn't just theoretical. His defense of resistance to tyranny helped feed the political imagination of generations who dared to challenge kings, emperors, and dictators. In the discourses, he makes it clear that when a ruler crosses the line, crushes the laws, and governs only for himself, he loses legitimacy, and the people have the right and the duty to resist. People, at their core, want only not to be oppressed. This line is a reminder that the most basic human impulse is toward freedom. Machiavelli doesn't idealize the people, but he recognizes them as a decisive historical force. Without popular engagement, the republic gets sick. Without citizen vigilance, power corrodes. That's why his philosophy is, above all, a call to active citizenship. For him, freedom is only possible when citizens take responsibility for building and defending the state. It's not enough to just hope for good rulers. People need to take part, keep watch, criticize, and resist when necessary. In the end, the Machiavelli who inspired revolutions was not the advisor to princes. He was the architect of freedom. His republican thought broke out of the limits of the Renaissance and became one of the pillars of modern politics. He taught us that freedom is not a gift from God, nor a right guaranteed automatically by nature. It's a historical and institutional construction that demands effort, intelligence, and collective commitment. He taught us that resisting tyranny is a rational act, not just an emotional reaction, and that civic virtue is the beating heart of every lasting republic. No thinker before Machiavelli had the courage to say, clearly and directly, that politics doesn't need to be just in order to be effective. That sentence isn't cheap shock value. It's the foundation of a new way of thinking about power. Machiavelli was the first to suggest that politics should be studied as it really works, not as we wish it would be. This bold move, often misunderstood, is what makes him a true forerunner of modern political science. Instead of writing treatises full of perfect ideals like Plato did, or trying to reconcile earthly power with heavenly values like so many medieval philosophers, Machiavelli looked at politics with a dry eye. He examined power games, betrayals, failures, and victories with the coldness of a surgeon, without moralizing, without idealizing, without hiding how ugly reality can be. This naked, courageous, analytical way of looking at things is what allowed him to take the first steps toward a more scientific approach to politics, an approach based on observation, experience, and practical reasoning, not on abstract principles. For centuries, thinkers treated politics as an extension of ethics. To govern well meant, above all, being morally virtuous. A good ruler should be just, kind, obedient to God, and a moral example for their subjects. Machiavelli, without denying that morality has value, showed that it's not enough to explain political success or failure. A prince can be personally virtuous and still see his state fall to more cunning enemies. Or he can be harsh and still save his people from civil war. By proposing this separation between morality and politics, Machiavelli took a decisive step. He turned politics into its own field of analysis, with its own inner logic, based on power dynamics, unstable human passions, and the strength of institutions. He didn't say politics should ignore ethics, but that, if it wants to survive, it has to learn to move between what is right and what is possible. Machiavelli isn't just a theorist. He's a careful observer of political reality. Every chapter of The Prince and Discourses on the First Decade of Titus Livy contains analysis grounded in real history. He compares rulers, studies the Roman past, the conflicts in Italy, and the successes and failures of famous leaders. He watches, compares, and draws conclusions. That's basically an early empirical method. He looks at experience to extract principles, not the other way around. That's why we can say Machiavelli anticipates a scientific spirit inside political thought. He doesn't force a ready-made theory onto the world. He pulls rules out of the world as it is. His analysis is cold, but not purely cynical. He knows that power can be necessary to keep peace. That violence, when used in a calculated way at the right moments, can save a state. And that a ruler's virtue isn't just about personal morality, but about their ability to read the situation, act with courage, and ensure the survival of the republic. If modern political science is concerned with what is possible, and not with what's ideal, it's because Machiavelli taught that. For him, governing is not following a handbook of eternal virtues, but dealing with contingencies. Politics is made with whatever is on the table: interests, passions, unstable alliances, and unexpected crises. And inside that chaos, the ruler has to decide. Political decision-making for Machiavelli is always strategic. It's less about right or wrong in a moral sense and more about does it work or does it fail. He analyzes how decisions shape the fate of states and how fortune, luck, or circumstance can be faced with intelligence, courage, and boldness. This idea that politics demands adaptation to reality, a sense of timing, and effective action is one of the pillars of modern political analysis. It turns politics from a space of wishful thinking into a space of strategy, and that's exactly what a serious, reality-based political science tries to understand. Plato wanted to form philosopher kings. St. Augustine wanted power to serve the city of God. Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile faith and reason to build a just order. Machiavelli flips the script. He doesn't want politics to bow to morality or religion. He wants politics to be strong, functional, and able to face the world as it actually is. This break is painful for many readers, especially for those who expect politics to express purity. But it's a necessary break. Machiavelli forces us to accept that the world isn't ruled by perfect ideas, but by human wills, power structures, and clashes of forces. Only by recognizing this can we, ironically, act more responsibly within it. By separating politics from morality, proposing observation as a method, and analyzing power based on its effects instead of its purity, Machiavelli created the conditions for politics to become an independent discipline, something that can be studied, debated, and understood logically and factually. Political science as we know it today drinks from that source. Concepts like reason of state, institutional stability, balance of powers, governability, and even modern analysis of international relations grow out of this pragmatic, realistic view. Machiavelli didn't just describe politics, he taught us how to think about it with rigor. In the end, what Machiavelli offers is a lesson in intellectual maturity. He invites us to remove the masks, drop the comforting speeches, and face the hardest challenge: understanding politics without illusions. That doesn't mean approving corruption, tyranny, or manipulation. It means recognizing them as real possibilities in the game of power, and, by understanding them, knowing how to confront them. Only those who truly understand politics can change it. And that's why Machiavelli wasn't a destroyer of ethics, like many claim. He was a liberator of political reason. Machiavelli's ideas never went unnoticed. From the moment his works began to circulate, they sparked strong reactions: admiration, fear, censorship, reinterpretation, and inspiration. Some called him a demon, others called him a master of politics. But one thing you can't say is that he was ever ignored. The fate of Machiavelli's works over time is a real mirror of the tension between power and free thought. In every era, his texts have been reread, reinterpreted, and used, sometimes to justify authoritarian governments, sometimes to support revolutions. He was censored by the church, praised by revolutionaries, studied by statesmen, and feared by moralists. In this lesson, we're going to understand how this author, born in a divided and chaotic Florence, managed to cross centuries being read, hidden, twisted, and, above all, surviving. Right after his death in 1527, Machiavelli's name was already surrounded by controversy. His name became associated with coldness, deceit, and manipulation. This came mainly from the way people read The Prince, published posthumously in 1532. By arguing that a ruler has to learn how not to be good, that he can use fear as a political tool, and that in some situations he must act against common morality to protect the state, Machiavelli broke with the entire Christian tradition that dominated European political thought at the time. And that came with a price. Very quickly, The Prince was seen by many as a handbook of cynicism, and Machiavelli himself as a dangerous author, almost a political heretic. The most symbolic reaction came in 1559, when the Catholic Church put Machiavelli's works on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the famous index of forbidden books. That placed Machiavelli alongside authors like Galileo, Luther, and Copernicus, thinkers who, each in their own way, challenged the Church's structures of power. But here's the interesting part. The book that scared the Church the most wasn't The Prince, but Discourses on the First Decade of Titus Livy. The reason is simple. While The Prince could be read as an authoritarian text, the Discourses openly defended the Republic, popular freedom, and the right to resist corrupt power, extremely dangerous ideas in a Europe dominated by absolute monarchies and papal authority. By banning Machiavelli, the Church was trying to put out a fire that was already burning, and it didn't work as planned. The ban had the opposite effect. It increased curiosity and expanded the underground circulation of his works. Scholars, politicians, intellectuals, and even clergymen started looking for copies of his books, which were passed around in handwritten versions or disguised editions. Reading Machiavelli became, for many, an act of intellectual rebellion, an invitation to think about power without illusions. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, The Prince had already been translated into several languages, commented on by theorists, and cited in debates about government, freedom, religious reform, and reason of state. The political reading of Machiavelli's works only grew over time. Great statesmen found in him not just a practical guide, but a deep thinker of political action in times of crisis. In England, Francis Bacon studied his ideas. In the 17th century, James Harrington drew on Machiavelli to defend the Republic as a superior form of government, influencing British political thought and, later, American thought as well. In the United States, the Founding Fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and James Madison, read and quoted Machiavelli, especially the discourses. They saw him as an ally of freedom, a thinker who understood the dangers of tyranny and the importance of republican institutions. During the French Revolution, Robespierre and other Jacobin leaders also quoted him. At that moment, Machiavelli was interpreted as someone who exposed the hypocrisy of power and promoted republican virtue as an antidote to despotism. Later, in the 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte carried a copy of The Prince with him during his campaign in Italy, and in the 20th century, Lenin read Machiavelli with strategic interest. Not as a fan, but as someone who understood that politics demands effectiveness, calculation, and decision. These uses are obviously ambiguous. The same author served as a reference for liberal and revolutionary thinkers, for democratic leaders, and for tyrants. That only reinforces the richness and complexity of his work, and its incredible ability to adapt to different historical contexts. As the human sciences advanced, Machiavelli stopped being read only as a counselor of princes. He began to be studied as a foundational thinker of modern politics. In the 20th century, authors like Antonio Gramsci saw in Machiavelli a strategist of revolution. In his prison notebooks, Gramsci develops the idea of a modern prince, not an individual, but a political party capable of unifying popular forces to build a new historical bloc. Other philosophers, like Hannah Arendt, saw Machiavelli as a thinker of action and freedom. Arendt recognized in his texts an effort to think politics as something rooted in reality, not subordinated to abstract systems. On top of that, analytic philosophy and modern political science started to recognize in Machiavelli the first author to treat politics as an autonomous field, separate from morality and theology, as we saw in the previous lesson. Despite the depth of his ideas, Machiavelli's name was also absorbed into popular culture in a distorted way. The adjective Machiavellian became a synonym for cold, evil, manipulative behavior. That's unfair to a thinker who, in many moments, defended popular freedom and criticized abuses of power. This caricature formed partly because of quick, shallow readings of The Prince, and partly because of the fear his work always caused in those who wanted to preserve the myth that politics should always be pure, harmless, and morally spotless. But the truth is different. Machiavelli wasn't an advocate of evil. He was a radical realist. And that realism still makes people uncomfortable today. When we look at the historical journey of his works, we see something striking. A Renaissance author, censored and demonized, became one of the most influential thinkers of modern times. His texts have been used to justify empires and to tear them down, to form governments and to expose them. More than just an author of his time, Machiavelli became a tool for reading politics in any era. His work is still quoted in universities, offices, election campaigns, history books, movies, series, podcasts, and debates. And why? Because he offers something rare, an analysis of power without illusions. He teaches us that politics is made by humans, flawed, ambitious, unpredictable, and that to deal with it, we need more than good intentions. We need intelligence, strategy, prudence, and courage. If Machiavelli was read by revolutionaries and statesmen, if he helped found modern political science, if he wrote about virtue, freedom, and responsibility, then why do so many people still believe he was teaching people how to be evil? The answer is more uncomfortable than it seems. It's not just about a historical misunderstanding or a shallow reading of The Prince. The distortion of Machiavelli today still serves certain deep cultural and symbolic interests. There are people who need him to remain the devil of politics, because Machiavelli's thought, at its core, forces us to face politics as it is, not as we wish it were. Let's explore why, even 5 centuries after his death, people still lie about Machiavelli, and why his philosophy is still so subversive. Many thinkers have written about politics. Very few described it with the bluntness of Machiavelli. He doesn't offer us comfort or promises that good always wins. On the contrary, he shows that the powerful often do triumph, that personal morality doesn't always fit into the public arena, and that keeping a state together requires hard decisions. This deeply realistic stance clashes with our tendency to idealize politics. A lot of people still prefer to believe that governing is simply doing good, acting ethically, serving the people, and that any move away from this is automatically moral corruption. By showing that the gears of power are more complex than that, Machiavelli becomes uncomfortable. His philosophy doesn't offer redemption, it offers clarity. And clarity, for those who live off political illusion, is unbearable. The first reason people distort Machiavelli is, paradoxically, fear of the truth. There's a deep psychological and cultural resistance to admitting that politics involves force, strategy, cunning, interests, and yes, moral compromises. When he suggests that a leader may, in some situations, act against his word, or seem virtuous without actually being so, Machiavelli isn't glorifying lies. He's describing the world as it really works in the sphere of power. That makes people uncomfortable because it tears apart the romantic image of the ruler as a pure moral hero. This raw reality of politics, made of unpopular decisions, imperfect alliances, and inevitable clashes, wounds our collective desire for leaders who are pure, incorruptible, guided only by goodness. Machiavelli tells us that person doesn't exist, and because of that, many prefer to ignore him or reduce him to a cartoon villain, the Machiavellian. The second reason people still twist Machiavelli is cultural and, in a sense, ideological. We live in a tradition that, for centuries, shaped the idea that politics should reflect universal moral values. That idea has roots in classical philosophy and Christian morality, which saw politics as a reflection of the common good and divine order. From that point of view, a good ruler is someone who acts according to eternal justice, not according to the demands of reality. So any thinker who proposes a different logic, like Machiavelli, is seen as a deviant, a threat, a source of corruption. Keeping that myth alive serves a lot of interests. It helps protect idealistic speeches. It helps demonize political opponents based on unreachable moral standards. And above all, it helps maintain the illusion that power can be exercised without ever getting dirty. Machiavelli, however, blows all of that up. He says politics is not the place of purity, but of responsibility. That there is a difference between an individual's morality and the morality of a ruler. That sometimes to save a city, you need to make decisions that would be condemned in private life. That distinction is essential and deeply uncomfortable, which is why many people prefer to distort Machiavelli rather than accept him. Over the centuries, a lot of powerful figures couldn't, or didn't want to, ban Machiavelli outright. So they did something more subtle. They stained his reputation. They built the myth of the Machiavellian person, cold, manipulative, treacherous, power-hungry. This myth works like a form of symbolic censorship. It doesn't stop his books from existing, but it stops people from taking them seriously. After all, who wants to really study a writer who's constantly linked with evil, betrayal, and cruelty? Even in academic spaces, Machiavelli is often read in a shallow way, quickly, focusing only on the prince, while ignoring the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy, his letters, his plays, and his explicitly republican writings. Twisting Machiavelli in that sense is a way of taming him. It prevents his philosophy from forcing us to truly think politically. Even in modern democracies, there's a strong tendency to keep politics framed as a moral stage. You see this in the constant idea that every leader must be ethical, honest, upright, as if politics were simply an extension of private morality. Of course, ethics matters. Machiavelli never said it didn't, but he suggests a different approach. Instead of judging a politician only by what they say or seem to be, we should pay attention to what they actually do, what they manage to preserve, what disasters they prevent. This pragmatic view still scares people. In democracies, especially during crises or moments of polarization, the idealized image of the perfect politician comes back strong. And anything that doesn't fit that model is quickly labeled immoral. So, instead of learning from Machiavelli, many keep him on the margins, as a ghost of bad politics to be avoided, not understood. Another factor that keeps the distortion alive is selective ignorance. Many people quote Machiavelli without ever having read him. Or they read only The Prince and completely ignore the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy, where he openly defends the republic, institutions, and popular freedom. Few people know that Machiavelli admired Republican Rome, praised popular participation, and defended institutional conflict as a way to keep political balance. He wasn't a fan of tyranny. He was a critic of illusions that lead states to collapse. This ignorance, combined with the interest in keeping the myth alive, sustains a shallow, false image. And worse, it stops his real lessons from helping to shape more aware and critical citizens. For all these reasons, Machiavelli is still distorted today. Not just by accident, but because truly thinking politically takes courage. It means letting go of childish fairy tales about power, giving up idealized fantasies, and diving into what actually happens behind the scenes of government. That kind of courage is rare, so it's much easier to paint Machiavelli as a villain than to accept him as a master of political reason. But for those who dare go beyond the surface, Machiavelli offers something rare: freedom of thought. He doesn't tell us what we want to hear. He tells us what we need to understand, that politics is not made of dreams, but of concrete choices. And that by seeing it clearly, we can not only criticize it, but also change it. We live in a world full of beautiful promises, idealistic speeches, and moral rhetoric. But real problems, social crises, power struggles, and random events rarely fit inside those ready-made speeches. It's on this rough ground of reality that Machiavelli's thought shows how relevant it still is. More than a historical figure, Machiavelli gives us intellectual tools to understand politics and collective life without naivety, with clarity and responsibility. One of Machiavelli's core lessons is that politics doesn't happen according to abstract ideals, but according to concrete circumstances. He suggests that a ruler, or any engaged citizen, should look at facts, forces at play, human relationships, and unexpected events, and act from there. That lesson is still powerful today. In the face of crises, economic, environmental, social, it's tempting to jump straight to moral, utopian, or idealistic solutions, but they're not always effective. Machiavelli reminds us that before imagining the world as it should be, we need to understand how it actually is. That kind of intellectual sobriety opens the door to realistic strategies, more conscious choices, and less disappointment. A lot of conversations about power fall into a false choice. Either power is holy, exercised by virtuous heroes, or it's demonic, in the hands of cruel tyrants. Machiavelli rejects that kind of split thinking. For him, power is complex and ambiguous, shaped by virtù, ability, talent, prudence, and fortuna, unpredictability, circumstances, luck. With that, he teaches us something crucial. Institutions, laws, prudence, and responsibility matter as much as, or more than, the personal goodness of whoever is in charge. In today's world, where we quickly idolize or demonize leaders and governments, that lesson is huge. It helps us separate what depends on personal qualities and what depends on systems and structures, and it keeps us from reducing everything to simple heroes and villains. For Machiavelli, virtù is not virtue in the classic Christian sense. It's the practical ability to act well in the middle of complexity, intelligence, courage, adaptability, prudence. Someone who acts with virtù knows how to read the moment, weigh risks, make hard decisions, and take responsibility for them. Today, in uncertain times, climate crises, economic instability, rapid change, virtue seems more necessary than ever. Whether you're leading a country, a company, a community, or just trying to participate actively in public life, the ability to see clearly, think strategically, adapt, and decide wisely makes all the difference. Machiavelli reminds us that good intentions aren't enough. You need the ability to act. Machiavelli knew that not everything depends on human will. Fortuna, luck, chance, unpredictable events has a huge impact on the life of states and individuals. But he also said that even in the face of fortuna, it's possible to act with virtue to reduce risks, seize opportunities, and survive storms. Applied to today, that means building societies and institutions that are resilient, adaptable, realistically planned, and pragmatic, not based on illusions of permanence, but on structures that can withstand change and surprises. That applies to public policy, governance, community groups, and even personal choices. Machiavelli was one of the first to separate private morality from political ethics. What's right for an individual doesn't always work for the common good or for the stability of a state. That doesn't mean rejecting morality. It means adapting it to the collective context and to the demands of public life. Today, in pluralistic and complex societies, that distinction is still essential. Personal morality can clash with collective needs, and difficult decisions need to be evaluated honestly, not through cheap moralism. Thinking politically with responsibility, the way Machiavelli suggests, can help us avoid polarization, empty promises, and heated rhetoric, and push us instead toward concrete, well-thought-out, smart actions. Even though Machiavelli is often associated with authoritarian power, he also valued strong institutions, an organized state, and stable structures as ways to guarantee freedom, order, and the common good. For today's world, still marked by fragile institutions, corruption, polarization, and governance crises, that lesson is key. Politics shouldn't depend only on good leaders. It should rely on institutions, systems, checks and balances, citizen participation, and separation of powers. A healthy republic or democracy needs more than good intentions. It needs structures that can survive even when leadership is bad. Machiavelli understood that power depends on how people see it, on public image, trust, and legitimacy. He said that men judge more by their eyes than by their hands, meaning reputation and political symbolism matter a lot. In today's media-saturated world, full of social networks and instant visibility, that is even more true. Rulers, leaders, and institutions need to be aware that public trust is built not only by what they actually do, but also by how those actions are perceived. Transparency, consistency, and clear communication are all part of the art of governing well. And Machiavelli, who lived in an age of intrigue, rivalry, and propaganda, already knew that. We live in a time of fake news, polarization, radical speeches, and easy promises. In the middle of all that, Machiavellian realism offers a powerful antidote: the demand that we check facts, analyze structures, understand incentives and consequences, and question utopias and empty promises. Instead of instantly buying into every moral or ideological speech, we're pushed to think critically, with our eyes open, looking at what's actually possible and at the real risks involved. This realism isn't bitterness, it's responsibility. It forces citizens, leaders, and societies to face problems seriously and to think about solutions that take complexity into account, not fantasy. For anyone who believes politics can and should be transformative, that might be Machiavelli's greatest legacy. Finally, and maybe most importantly, Machiavelli teaches that real politics is a commitment to the collective, to what is real, to what is concrete. It's not about chasing absolute ideals or unreachable utopias, but about working within human and historical limits to build something real: fair institutions, social order, civic participation, freedom, stability. For today's world, marked by inequality, crises, injustice, and uncertainty, that's a lesson in humility and ambition at the same time. Humility to recognize that there are no perfect solutions, ambition to use reason, courage, and virtue to transform reality as much as possible. What keeps Machiavelli relevant isn't nostalgia or some cult of history. It's the brutal relevance of his clarity. He stripped power bare, saw politics without filters, understood that morality can clash with survival, and showed that a true leader, or a true citizen, has to be pragmatic, honest about reality, and willing to act. In a time of global uncertainty, environmental crisis, economic instability, political polarization, and new challenges, we need serious thinking. And the courage to actually use it. We need virtue to act well, realism to see the world as it is, and an ethics of responsibility to decide what is worth fighting for and at what cost. Machiavelli doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't promise golden ages or perfect leaders. What he gives us, and maybe this is his greatest gift, is a toolkit for living politically, without illusions, with awareness, and with our minds clear. When we step away from the heat of stereotypes and go back to Machiavelli's pages without prejudice, something essential becomes clear. His work is not a handbook on cruelty. It's a treatise on political realism, a lesson on how the ideal and the real overlap, or better yet, an invitation to move through politics with your eyes open, feet on the ground, and a strategic mind. Machiavelli doesn't teach us to hate, betray, or dominate just for the sake of. He teaches us to understand power as a complex human phenomenon, full of contradictions, risks, and responsibilities. And above all, he warns us. Anyone who refuses to face this complexity won't be punished by morality, but by failure. His philosophy is, before anything else, a way of resisting political naivete. In this conclusion, I want to show why Machiavelli is still so necessary and so unfairly judged today, and why a careful reading of his work slowly dismantles the labels that insist on clinging to his name. From ancient times, many thinkers wanted politics to mirror transcendent virtues: justice, goodness, piety, altruism. These ideas are noble, but as Machiavelli knew, they often don't fit the real world outside philosophy classrooms or private ethics. Politics is not pure philosophy, and it's not a moral ritual. It's an arena of interests, forces, uncertainty, and human passion. Violence, ambition, fear, bad luck, all of that exists. Pretending it doesn't is like building castles out of sand. Machiavelli refuses that hypocrisy. He invites us to see politics stripped of illusions, not glamorous, not demonic, just human and real. That clear-eyed view isn't seductive. It doesn't give us moral heroes, but it gives us clarity. When we accept that politics can fail, that a good ruler can fall, that a republic can collapse, that fate can be brutal, we gain the freedom to think about solutions that don't depend on rare personal virtues, but on structures, strategies, and institutions. That freedom is what makes Machiavelli a thinker of hope, not resignation. He doesn't promise purity, he promises lucidity. And maybe that's exactly what bothers those who prefer comforting narratives. A politics that accepts the harshness of reality is dangerous, for the naive and for the powerful. But it's also the most honest and the most effective. One of Machiavelli's core ideas, and one of the most misunderstood, is that private morality doesn't map directly onto public morality. He doesn't reject virtues. He just says that in politics, the standard for judging an action is the result, not just the intention. That doesn't mean he's proposing a moral free-for-all. It means he's proposing an ethics of responsibility. If you have the power to make decisions that affect millions of lives, you have to weigh consequences, risks, and institutions, not just your personal conscience. Deciding isn't a private act, it's a public act. And the public has names, faces, and stories. When a ruler accepts that responsibility, they realize that kindness without prudence can destroy the state just as much as open tyranny. They learn that compassion without limits can lead to chaos, insecurity, and even greater suffering. And that force without justice becomes abuse, while justice without authority turns into empty utopia. Machiavelli doesn't demand immorality. He demands realism with awareness. He demands that rulers, and by extension, anyone involved in public life, understand that hard decisions exist, and pretending they don't won't make them disappear. What makes them disappear is refusing to see reality. In Machiavelli's philosophy, virtue is not the same as kindness, pity, or moral purity. It means competence, firmness, initiative, and the courage to act. Governing well requires virtue, and virtue requires realism. Facing crises, making unpopular decisions, responding to threats, all of that demands someone who can act with clarity and a cool head. That virtue is not heroic in a romantic sense. It's not about looking good in speeches. It's about survival, stability, and order. It's about building institutions, protecting people, and keeping the peace, even when that means making hard, grey, uncertain choices. When we understand virtue this way, we stop demonizing power and start evaluating it with more realistic standards. We stop asking only if the ruler is morally pure and start asking if they are effective, fair, and responsible in the way they use means and pursue ends. That's a powerful lesson for modern societies, where rhetoric often outweighs practice and good intentions get lost in bureaucracy, corruption, or incompetence. Another vital legacy of Machiavelli is his focus on institutions and law, not as moral ornaments, but as guarantees of stability, predictability, and freedom. He understood that tyranny doesn't come from absolute power only because rulers are evil, but because institutions are weak and allow abuse. When rules are clear, responsibilities are defined, and power is limited, even flawed leaders can be kept in check. A well-structured republic, separation of powers, citizen participation, and mutual oversight. All of that creates conditions for politics to become less of a war of wills and more of a negotiation of interests, grounded in laws and shared respect. That institutional focus makes Machiavelli a defender of freedom. He doesn't believe in magical moral formulas to protect it. He believes in structures. And that's one of his greatest legacies, showing that freedom doesn't depend only on good people. It depends on good systems. Maybe Machiavelli's biggest lesson for us today is this: we can't pretend politics is clean, ideal, and morally pure. But we can and should demand clarity, responsibility, and consistency from it. We can resist easy speeches, empty promises, and shallow moralizing. Being a citizen in this sense also means refusing to be naive. It means questioning comforting narratives. It means demanding accountability, judging actions and consequences. And above all, it means keeping our political imagination alive. The imagination that knows ordinary reality can change, that injustice can be challenged, and that power can be used to build, not just to destroy. Machiavelli teaches us that thinking politically is not about stacking abstract values. It's about making concrete choices with intelligence, prudence, and an eye on the future. It's recognizing that the world is imperfect, but not giving up on it. It's betting on civic virtue, on engagement, on participation. It's understanding that private morality matters, but it's not enough. That love of personal power is dangerous, but love of collective freedom is legitimate and necessary. The accusation that Machiavelli taught people to be cruel, manipulative, and ruthless has deep roots. But it only holds if we ignore how complex his texts really are. The selective reading of lines like, "It is better to be feared than loved," without context, and without considering the limits he himself sets. That kind of reading feeds fears, moralism, and interests that prefer predictable, easy-to-control leaders, rather than questioning, informed citizens. If we go back to his writings carefully, we see that Machiavelli criticizes unchecked tyranny, defends the republic and popular participation, values civic virtue, law, and institutional freedom, recognizes the dangers of absolute power and ruling by permanent fear. In other words, his philosophy does not promote evil. It calls for wisdom, responsibility, and realism. His proposal is less about seduction and more about warning, less about personal glory and more about collective achievement, less about oppression and more about just order. We live in an age of grand promises, heated speeches, and intense polarization. We see governments swinging between idealism and raw pragmatism, between speeches and crises. Uncertainty seems to be everywhere: economic, social, climate, political. In the middle of all this, Machiavelli's philosophy appears like a compass, not to lead us to comfort, but to help us move across the hard ground of reality. We need Machiavelli today, not to justify tyrannies, but to avoid letting empty hopes destroy institutions. We need him to demand ability, courage, and prudence from leaders, to remind us that freedom and order depend on laws, accountability, and participation, to keep utopia alive, but with its feet on the ground, to insist that politics can be complex, difficult, even dirty at times, but that this doesn't justify immorality or giving up. Machiavelli calls us to clarity, to vigilance, to civic responsibility, to the courage to decide, even when the cost might be high. He doesn't offer magic solutions. He offers a way of seeing, the view of someone who refuses naivete and doesn't back down in front of complexity. That is his great legacy: to think politically with realism, awareness, and hope, even when the world seems to be working against reason. And if you made it all the way here with an open heart and focused mind, I truly thank you. Bringing back the real Machiavelli, far from the stigma, caricatures, and cliches, is something that takes intellectual courage, and you were part of that. If this content made you think, helped you see politics with more clarity and less illusion, then it was already worth it. Subscribe to the channel. That way, you directly support this work of deep analysis and critical thinking. Like the video if it brought you value. Drop a comment. What surprised you the most about Machiavelli's philosophy? Which other philosophers would you like to see here on the channel? Share this with someone who also needs to understand politics with more maturity and less naivety. And of course, stay here with us. There's a lot more coming. Philosophy applied to life, society, and history. Always with depth, clarity, and respect for the intelligence of everyone watching. Thank you so much for walking with me this far. See you in the next video.